Hi everyone, it's Vanessa. Today I wanted to wrap up some more things that I read, mostly towards the end of November for Nonfiction November, as well as some things that I started in December. The first thing that I want to mention is Citizen by Claudia Rankine. This is a collection of prose, poetry, and photographs that Claudia Rankine put together, having to do with microaggressions that she has faced as a black woman, as well as microaggressions that her peers have faced as well. In this collection, she writes a lot about different news events that occurred in the 2000s that I wasn't very much aware of. One example of that is the Gen 6, who were 6 black teens convicted of beating a white student that they attended school with. The original charges that were filed against them were very harsh. A lot of people thought that they were excessive and that people thought it was racially charged why they were so excessive. And she speaks of the Gen 6 in here and gave me a jumping off point to go research more about this because I had no idea when it happened in 2007. I was 14 years old. Another event she writes about is James Craig Anderson, who was murdered in a hate crime in Mississippi in 2011. A group of white people were driving around intending to throw bottles at black people in majority black neighborhoods. They came across James Craig Anderson trying to get into his car. They robbed and beat him, and then they ran over him with a truck. Probably my favorite piece in the entire book, though, was about Serena Williams and the racist and unfair calls that she received from tennis spectators and referees. Really what came across in that piece is that people couldn't really accept the fact that Serena Williams was here to stay, that she was the best in her field, and that she could express rage. People weren't okay with any of those things. It was kind of like a love letter to Serena Williams, the way that she, regardless of what was being called out to her from fans and from referees, she never decided, okay, this is too much and I'm going to leave the sport. She remained and she just got better and better. Now it's like undeniable for us to think that Serena Williams is not the best tennis player of all time, or to think she's one of the best athletes of all time. There were definitely some things that I think went over my head, especially towards the end of the book. The styles that she uses sometimes and the way she mixes like photographs and, mixed media into this prose was at times a little bit difficult for me to understand, as well as the fact that I don't face the microaggressions that Claudia Rankine faced, so I'm sure that there were some things of that nature that went over my head as well. But I think just from the originality of this work, I think it's worth picking up just because it mixes so many different things together, and it will bring your attention to lesser known news events that we don't talk about every day that occurred in the 2000s to 2010s. The next book that I read is Lighter Than My Shadow by Katie Green. I thought that the content in this was really necessary and unlike anything that I've really read in a graphic memoir. It focuses on her eating disorder as well as her OCD and compulsive thoughts through all of her recovery as well as the relapses that she faced. I also liked the art in this. In a lot of ways it was different as well, using like her literal thoughts and putting them into the pictures. So one specifically was when she would be binging on food in the middle of the night, she would draw like a mouth on her stomach, like she couldn't contain it because the mouth on her stomach was the one that was acting. There were other parts where like her whole body shattered in pieces because that is how she emotionally felt. So those were the high points in the art and in what I liked about the story here. The low points for me had to do with the art and with the story. I recently heard Stephanie from That's What She Read talk about being confused with faces and like not having very good facial recognition when it comes to characters that look very similar in a graphic form, and I felt that here. Katie and her friends looked very similar together, like the same facial features. The only difference would be their hair, and for me it would be really difficult to remember like which best friend of Katie's is this? Is this the childhood best friend or the college best friend? That I think was taking away from me and making me a little bit confused while I was consuming this story. Story-wise, I thought that the dialogue didn't really propel the story as well as it could have, and I felt like the best parts was when we could hear Katie's inner monologue and what she was thinking as these events were occurring, and I wish we had gotten more of that instead of kind of like the very simple like how are you, I'm good, how are you, kind of back and forth dialogue that didn't really add to the story. I also thought that the pacing was pretty off in this and the timing as well. I was very confused as to how much time had elapsed between pages, and there were parts in the story as well where she would stop the art and then put like a paragraph or two of text detailing to us what had occurred since the last picture, and that kind of showed us that time had elapsed, but we didn't get to see that through graphic memoir form. We just got to see that through words. There are definitely trigger warnings in this graphic novel, not just for eating disorders and OCD and mental illness, but also there's abuse in this story, and I don't really know if I really liked how it was handled. Like, she couldn't really speak up, and there were people around her that felt like things were off but weren't really stepping in, and it was just really difficult to read that stuff. The next book that I read was Footnotes from the World's Greatest Bookstores by Bob Eckstein. This book is all about little bookshops across the world and little stories about them. So this is all divided into introducing you to what this bookshop is all about, what they focus on when they got started, stuff about their owners, and then an illustration by Bob Eckstein of this bookshop. The illustrations were so beautiful. I love the art. They're the kind of things that I would be fine putting up on my walls in my home, and I think that says a lot of like what I think is good illustrations, if I think that they are worthy of my walls. So I really like the art, and I think it's worth it just for that. This book had a lot of really great stories. For me, they were best consumed in batches of like 4 to 5 bookshops. The stories in the book are really fun, silly, bizarre, humorous stories about either literary figures that have gone to these bookshops, actors or actresses who have gone to this bookshop, or funny, bizarre stories about customers, people who work there, or the owners. So if you're looking for something to kind of decompress and to just read about interesting little stories, I think this is something great to pick up. The next thing that I read was Human Acts by Kang, and this is translated by Deborah Smith, the same as The Vegetarian. This is a novel primarily about the Gwangju uprising in South Korea in the 1980s, as a lot of people were trying to instill more pro-democracy institutions into society, and a lot of the demonstrators were murdered by soldiers. There are definitely a lot of heavy topics here, and there's not much optimism, but I'm personally okay with that. What this book did really well for me is made me think about the presence of the state in a society, and how the state is really the only group that can own violence in the society. Moreover, it's not just the state telling these soldiers to do the killing. It's really looking at how these soldiers are okay with beating, maiming, killing citizens, how we could just diminish the humanity of other people. It's the state who tells the soldiers to do these things, but ultimately what Kang is saying is that these soldiers are the ones who pull the trigger. I also thought while reading this book about the nationalism that the society experiences, just the surrealness of you being killed at the hands of soldiers who were told to do that by the state, and then having them sing the national anthem, and then having them drape the flag over you after you are killed. It's very weird to think how those two things could coexist. That you could be murdered at the hands of the state, but you could still be celebrated as a citizen of the state. So I really like the subject here. I like how Kang writes such a difficult topic and an important topic to her country's history. What I didn't really like as much was the multiple narrators, because I felt like that caused me to not really follow along as to who was who. The people that you hear about in one chapter are important to future chapters. I didn't really get that until like the 3rd chapter, and I continually kept going back and forth trying to connect names together. Like, I remember that name is from chapter 1, what did they do in chapter 1, and just going back and forth and not really feeling like any personalities were really sealed or that I understood people as singular beings. And that's something that Claire brought up as well. I buddy read this with her, and she was just mentioning how nobody really had any defining qualities, and I totally agree with that. I think that was my main problem with this book. And I think that follows really well to, I kept comparing this book to The Vegetarian, and that's not really good when you're going into a book to compare it to the last thing you read by that author. But I read The Vegetarian so recently ago, I couldn't not think about The Vegetarian. I also compared it to The Vegetarian a lot because The Vegetarian used a lot of the same things. The writing is similar and the multiple narrators are also similar, but I think in The Vegetarian that was done so much better because it was a personal story about this family. I felt like I understood each character a lot better in The Vegetarian than I did here. Here they felt a lot more distant. Also in The Vegetarian there were some really strange parts or really confusing parts that as you were reading them you were kind of like, what is going on? I don't understand. And then as you kept reading they kind of resolved themselves. In this one I think the same tactic was being used, but I don't think that it was as successful as The Vegetarian in that way. Maybe it is because The Vegetarian is so much more of a weirder story of these ideas that are kind of even psychedelic in a way, and in Human Acts it's not really, because it's focused more on a tragedy and on something a lot more tangible, something that you can actually feel and see, while in The Vegetarian it had to do a lot with the mind. But I do understand why so many people enjoy this. I think the subject matter is still what draws me to Hong Kong, just how she tries to really sift through what is humanity, what is morally okay, how can we be as humans this evil and murderous, how could we have all of these intricacies to us. I like all those things about Hong Kong, but I just think I like the vegetarian better. And last but not least, I just finished Thornhill this morning, and I have a lot of thoughts about this, and they're not very good. This is a dual story that focuses on two young girls. One is set in 1982 and one is set in 2017. The one from 1982 is told strictly in diary format, and the one in 2017 is told through sequential full-page art, very similar to how Brian Selznick does his books. When I got into this book, I kind of expected it to look like Brian Selznick's book, but to have more of like a creepy or eerie take. As you can see from the front cover, this is supposed to be a mystery. This is supposed to be slightly creepy. The art, you can tell, is kind of creepy. So I kind of had these expectations of like a mix-up of Neil Gaiman and Brian Selznick, I guess, and what I really got here was none of that. I got interesting art. I like the art, and without the art, this book would just be a total bomb. It wouldn't work at all. But I think what really didn't work in this book was the diary entries and the voice that came through those diary entries. The girl from 1982's story was just very predictable. It was very monotone. She doesn't really transform or change as the story continues. It's just kind of like a sad story of bullying that continued being sad all throughout until the end. The ending was even a little bit interesting. Things ended up happening, but I think the beginning and middle just squandered my enjoyment of this. I really wouldn't recommend this book. There are a lot better graphic novels out there, I think. So that's it for all the books that I've read since the last time I wrapped up. I wanted to quickly mention some of the things that I was getting through, and it's kind of sad because I'm still reading Evicted, guys. And this book is not a page turner, so I should be finished with this book. The last time I checked in with you guys, I was at 75 pages, and now I'm at 167. So I still have like 120, 150 pages to go. Another thing that I started was I Can't Breathe by Matt Taibbi. I am doing a buddy read of this with Patrice Jones, and we are really enjoying this book. I was really hesitant going into this, and I'm sure this will come up when I do my wrap up. This author has been accused by some people of sexual harassment and of saying demeaning things about women in some of his books and in some of his journalism that he did back in the day in Russia, and I've continued to feel really weird about picking this book up and supporting a person that, you know, people are coming out against. But I will say that the content in here and his writing, I think, is good. So I'm gonna continue to read this with my critical lens, but so far, me and Patrice are liking this book. And then the other book that I started last night is Smoke Gets in Your Eyes by Caitlin Doughty. I'm doing a buddy read of this with Erin at the Bibliotherapist. She's a bit ahead of me, I think like 40-ish pages ahead of me. We are both really enjoying it. There are some parts in this already that I'm like, wow, that's weird and interesting. I really enjoy like how she narrates this and how her voice comes through. Her personality really shines, I think. So I'm really enjoying this, and I'm hoping to finish this soon because it's due at the library in like a week. And that is it for me and this wrap up / what I'm currently reading. I hope that you enjoyed listening to my thoughts on these books. If you've read any of these or would like to read any of these, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye bye.